Uh, Hello, everybody. We are live. We are live on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So, welcome to this last live talk in the Confluence cycle. We at Hikaya organized in partnership with Les Intergalactiques Festival here in Lyon. This has been quite a run, and we are so happy to. Oh, I'm stuttering. And I'm so. Do you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
I had a bit of a camera glitch here. And we are very happy with this one because we are going to talk about Greek science fiction and fantasy with two invaluable guests today. Don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have in the chat. We will convey them to them. So we have today Dimitra Nikolaidou and Victor Tseftakis. And tell me if I mispronounce the names. I'm trying not to.
No worries.
No worries. Yes, you're not.
So you are writers, researchers, academics, translators within the Greek publishing industry. You're specialized in SFF, both in on the publishing side, on the writing side, and on the academic side. Dimitra, you received your PhD in English literature from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. You have a thesis in about role-playing games and speculative fiction, and you teach creative writing at Tales of the Weird, which you co-founded with Victor, present here. Victor, you also studied English literatures at Thessaloniki at the Aristotle University. You obtained an MA. Master? Is it?
MA, Master of Arts, yeah.
Correct. In creative writing at Kingston University. You have multiple novels published. So, Dimitra, you also have short stories published. And you also translate and help with editing and publishing authors in Greek. Please tell me if I forgot anything you deem important to say.
No, it's fine. I think you got everything.
Yeah,
pretty much.
we try to be on one. We try to be on one stop for everything that has to do with speculative in Greece, more or less, to be honest. To go to the market.
Well, that's that's right. That's what there was a earlier when we talked about this live talk, and because initially we science fiction has holds a big place in the live talks we have because it's like it's a major genre, but actually we go far beyond that because imaginaire, as we handle it at Hikaya, englobes science fiction and fantasy, the fairy tales and etc. So you tell me, we can talk about fantasy too. Then okay, we have double the things too.
Yes, that's true.
Speculative in general, and the thing is that in Greece, since it's not a huge country, so most authors, when groups are formed, when creative writing groups are formed, when publishing houses, specialized publishing houses start out, I think they soon find out that you get a wider audience if you actually diversify in the entirety of speculative fiction. Plus, you're more likely it's very hard to maintain a very segregated space between the genres. So people come into contact and occasionally try their hand even in genres in which they didn't initially set out to write. So there is a lot of moving between genres in Greek speculative.
Okay. So it's a fluid area of publishing in Greece. That's interesting because that is something that is kind of true in France, but still here we are more dealing with over specialization, like with subgenre in fantasy and etc. But you say Greek authors have a tendency to jump from genre to another, right?
Yeah. Of course, we do have authors that write almost exclusively in one genre, that prefer fantasy or that prefer science fiction. But it's also, I think, the most common. I think the most common occurrence is that an author will try their hand at something different. They will answer a call for an anthology occasionally, and most workshops, they start out sometimes as one genre and start welcoming others as well. Uh, Also, it's interesting that the first stories, the first speculative stories in Greek short. Speaking of modern short stories, they were written by mainstream authors who wanted to try their hand at something else, even if they were disguised as folkloric stories for various reasons, which I hope we get to in our talk. In the end, yes, it's there is a lot of jumping between and fluidity between writers.
Okay. Okay. So we are we talked about how there was also a whole lot to say about how Greek science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction unfolded in these last years, because the last 10 years have already been they've been a tough time for Greece, and on a longer and on a longer timetable, the country has changed shape many times, and it did it. Society has evolved rapidly, and do you see it reflected in the in the writing of speculative fiction and the reading and the publishing and the market globally of speculative fiction?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, perhaps we should give a framework of how it all started,
Well,
how it went.
if you can stand me waxing historical for a bit.
Oh, please do.
We have a great anthologist in Greece, Makis Panorios, who has published a 5 or 6 volume anthology of the Greek fantastic short stories. And I'm borrowing from him when I say that in the beginning, which was, in the 19th century, the fantastic was sidelined a lot, even though the oral tradition was vast, even though, of course, Greek mythology is what it is, hugely influential everywhere else. But the focus was on the socio-political changes, on the need to build a country, on the struggle for independence, and the influences that were coming mainly from France were naturalism and romanticism. That was the country where most most Greek authors had studied in. And so there was, when they came back and they established a literary scene, the fantastic was not among their priorities. And given that we haven't had a moment's peace since then, counting, I don't know how many civil wars and changes of regime and dictatorship up until the Second World War, it never became a priority. Still, almost every great author, one of the authors of the canon, of the literary canon, did write fantastic short stories. They did include in their anthologies, they did write them for newspapers. They kind of disguised it as folk stories, but they weren't really folk stories. They were fantastic stories written to appear like folk. But it was not the genre that people wanted to touch yet. And the thing is that after World War II, there came a civil war, in which, yes, unfortunately, that lasted for quite some time, and in which both sides developed a strong anti-American sentiment. Both the left and the right knew that they would lose the public if they ever did anything that supported the US, if they actually spoke in favor of the US. And for various political, I wouldn't say cultural reasons, it was mainly political, everything that came from the US was regarded as forced escapism, as a way to dilute the culture, to forcibly turn the country into something that was not. And that unfortunately included science fiction, despite science fiction having pretty proletarian roots, despite the fact that it is the genre that imagines better worlds, better forms of governance, different societies. It's the genre that asks, what if, hey guys, what if we did that? Maybe it would be better. Or the genre that says, hey, if we keep going like that, it's not going to end well. But none of that was appreciated, I'd say. And for that reason, publishers were very, very suspicious of science fiction in general. And
fantasy, of course.
Fantasy, here was the thing. Fantasy was was regarded as suitable for children. So it kind of flew under the radar. And horror benefited from a play in words. Horror was coming out under the label of thriller. And thriller could include supernatural horror stories and non-supernatural horror stories. So as everything was marketed in horror under the same label, the critics did not attack it as viciously. There was a lot of gatekeeping. There was a lot of disdain. It was considered paraliterature. It was considered a deliberate attempt. At the worst of times, it was considered a deliberate attempt to mislead the public. There is an anecdote. One of the major publishing houses that exist today made the first attempt to publish science fiction in the 60s. Of course, they didn't publish American authors. They published French, Polish, Russian authors, and they even dared to publish one British author. This is from Dr. Domna Pasturmadji's research, which is still a great resource, a great academic resource for anyone who's looking for something on the matter. And because he published science fiction, he got snubbed so hard at galas, at the place, the meetups and everything, that he felt compelled to publish everything from the ancient Greek canon. And that's how we got, for the first time, the ancient Greek canon published, because somebody had to defend themselves against accusations of having published science fiction, which is a weird. Yeah, that's how we got everything collected for the first time in antiquity, from the works of antiquity. Somebody had to say, hey, I'm still Greek even though I did publish science fiction. Now, of course, the actual thirst for science fiction could not be quenched. And despite the attacks, despite the lack of criticism of academic research, of publishing platforms, a lot of people went all out. They created zines. They created a lot of little groups.
And the clubs.
There were a lot of clubs that were meeting up and searching for books, either in very cheap bootleg translations, or people who were traveling abroad were bringing the books. It's not like they were illegal, just, snubbed. And slowly but surely, things got better.
Yes, and there were major players that helped in that. For example, Aleph.
Aleph was established much later.
In the 90s. No.
Okay. And so I'm the geek. And what happened was that, after 1974, democracy started finding its legs for good. and the people soon were free to leave behind this polarization. And that's how it started becoming more accepted. There was less eyebrow raising because it was still seen as paraliterature, but not as a political invasion anymore. Unfortunately, the old prejudice still lingers, but it's going away day by day. I mean, by that time, science fiction was still a very Greek. Um, it was still very Greek in what it did because, since we're not a spacefaring country, most of it focused on the everyday. It was mostly making comments on the everyday, but slowly but surely it started expanding. And then The Lord of the Rings was translated in the early 80s, and we all know how that goes. When The Lord of the Rings gets translated, everybody goes wild. A bit late here. And then, of course, in the late 90s, early 2000s came the internet, and it was much easier for people to find each other and be able to form communities. There was a very important magazine published called Nine, which was a part of a major newspaper, a respected newspaper, which brought speculative fiction and comics. It bestowed legitimacy on the fantastic, and it started a lot of conversations on why exactly are we snubbing it. And then with the advent of the internet, people found each other. And we could say more or less that the rest is history up until the financial crisis, which weirdly helped.
The financial crisis helped.
Yes, it did
It
help.
did.
Well, because there was during the financial crisis, self-publishing bloomed in Greece for some reason. Okay, and a lot of people also tried different things. They thought that they had nothing to lose, so they would try write different things. They tried being more open to what is going on in the international scene. So this, along with the self-publishing, which unfortunately, of course, was not all good. I mean, the problem with self-publishing here in Greece is that there is a total lack of criteria as to what gets published or not. So the quality of the majority of books that were self-published dropped.
Not all of them, of
not
course,
all of them,
but the standards are not always rigorous.
Yes, but still, because there were so many books self-published, the audience was there was more exposure of fantasy and speculative fiction to a wider audience, slowly and gradually building. And actually, I think that this boom in self-publishing did kind of pave the way for good books, really high quality books to be published by traditional publishing houses. And I think that a lot more writers got convinced to try and write speculative fiction, which might be what they always wanted to do but didn't dare because they thought that they would never be published. Of course, having said that, there are not so many publishing houses that actually dare publish speculative fiction in the traditional way.
Exclusively.
Okay, or exclusively, yes. But in the last, I don't know, 5 years, we've seen more and more traditional publishing houses trying,
including speculative works
yeah,
in their lineup.
Yes, and we do know that there are some very good books coming up. Yes,
so yes, it has changed a lot, and it keeps changing due to multiplicity of factors, including, the work of Greek speculative authors getting recognized abroad, being suggested for awards, getting awards, like the World Fantasy Award, being nominated for Hugo or a Nebula, seeing other authors being published and translated it encourages people when the fact that it's a small market, and thus it's always harder to find a platform for your work might discourage them. But the fact that most people feel that they can also send their work abroad.
Yes.
Sorry, can send their work abroad. It encouraged. It actually gave a new type of motivation to Greek authors.
So yeah, okay. So, but just because that's also something that we've seen on our side at IKEA, but also something we've talked about as three before. The fact that there's a hope of being published abroad. There's more opportunities, and the results of that tell me that most speculative fiction tends to be written, or at least those that aims to be published, it tends to be written in English directly.
That's yes. That's
not most.
Not most.
Well, it depends.
You would really need to have very deliberate statistics for that. But it's true that ambitious Greek authors, almost always try to get published in English for very specific reasons. One, it's a bigger market. Simply put, if there are 10 contests and 5 anthologies of speculative fiction coming out in Greece in any given year, there are hundreds of them in the specifically in the Anglo market. So people are going to either write in English directly or translate their work or have it translated. Not to mention, of course, that payment for one's work would be very, very different. Now, I must say that most authors in Greece would love to get published, in any other language without caring about the money. That's what we have noticed. But when it comes to get publishing in the English market, yes, it does play a part. It does play a role. The fact that, and it's not a matter of money because there is nobody writes because they want to get rich. It's a matter of motivation and recognition.
Also, I think there's another reason. I think that a lot of people, a lot of authors actually thought that they could express themselves better in English.
That's the bad part.
That's very interesting because we have it relates to what we were talking earlier, that in Greek, speculative fiction is branded or used to be branded in a specific way. And so a lot of authors now who were young readers, I don't know, some years ago, they had access to
exclusively English
editions or translations. There was no speculative culture, Greek speculative culture, that was visible and accessible to people. So they turned, and we're not out of this. Yes, we turned a lot to foreign, mainly English and American reads. So I think that's another reason why a lot of people are trying to directly write in English. I'm hopeful. I think that this is changing because a lot of those people that have tried to and have written directly in English are trying to bring that back in Greece. What I mean is that they're trying to write Greek speculative instead of try to mimic I don't know, an American trope.
Yes, that was a past trend. We saw that a lot I think we saw that a lot in the 80s and even the early 90s, in which a lot of authors, exactly because they didn't have access to a Greek speculative canon, they considered the genre, a foreign genre. So they imitated, but that didn't last long. And people started actually writing original Greek fiction, with here comes the bad part about the financial crisis helping speculative. That unfortunately, with the onslaught of new titles that happened then, a lot of them were still mimetic works. There were still
Many of them.
people, yeah, because a younger author who had still not gotten over the childhood disease of imitating the Anglo canon were capable of getting published. And so for a hot minute, the market was flooded with imitations. And because that was after, the boom of gaming and fantasy movies and fantasy series, a lot of them were not also only imitating English-speaking literature, but English-speaking media in general, which is why you still saw pseudo-medieval worlds in fantasy and a science fiction that almost seemed completely unrelated to Greek reality, even though in previous decades, Greek science fiction was very reflective of what was very preoccupied with issues of community, politics, society, what was going on. It was used as a mirror to reflect Greek culture. And for a few years, that disappeared. The reason that it disappeared was that, of course, the authors that were recognized wanted to go the traditional route. So what was happening was that until they found a publisher and the book got actually edited and there was a good cover drawn for it, it took longer for their work to come out. At this moment, though, the tide has turned, I think, and Greek authors are completely embracing what actually builds a national speculative scene, in part because it's obviously what is required of them. This is a very thin line, because you are writing about Greek issues, Greek topics. You're writing about what would bother a Greek author, you're writing about your experience, but you do it with one eye at the international market. So you kind of you often obey, not the tropes, not the cliches, but you kind of always keep in mind an international audience. That can be good because you're aware that there is a huge competition. You want to speak to as many people as possible to make yourself understood. You're not imitating, but you do not turn completely inwards either. So that can be very good. It can make you more universal an author. But it's true that it would be very interesting to see how an author writes when they don't feel they have to explain or hide something as well.
Or fit some international standards.
Yeah.
Whether those are good or bad, yes.
Which is kind of funny in itself, because we tend to speak about the international market, but it's easy to see that stories by Greek authors are very well appreciated in European markets. They are understood, well received, while you do have to water down a lot of things for the US market. It's different modes of narrative.
Yeah.
So, yes, there is that.
That is something that I think every European writer experience. I mean, we tend more and more, in France, I mean, you tend to have a trend to see the most successful fantasy writers being translated in pretty much every other European languages before they're translated in English. I'm exaggerating. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but we do see that we have this illusion of a paradise, being translated in English and having access to the huge Anglo-Saxon market. But it's actually so difficult because, they are, I mean, it's like less than 5% of foreign cultural products that they consume. So it's actually very much more difficult today. And I really get what you're saying, and we hear it also from Italian publishers and writers and German and French people in France. I hear it all the time.
Yeah,
But
because we have written stories or seen stories from students of ours, and from an American editor, they might come back with a note: "This is too unbelievable," or "How did that happen?" And every European would go, "Ah, yeah, that's my grandmother," or something like that. Which is why we're really happy that at this point, even mainstream publishing houses in Greece are finally starting to include Greek works, speculative works in their lineup. I mean, it's great to see that you don't. Of course, we would love to have more specialized publishing houses focusing on speculative fiction, but it's also great to know that authors also have the option to turn their work in one of the big houses or one of the smaller boutique houses, as we call them, the ones that are going to pick up quality work that fits a very specific brand, and they won't be turned down because it's speculative.
Okay. So we were talking about how even in the subject and the style that is used, you have one foot in looking internationally and one foot looking inward. So I have to, use this to go through another point more deeply. When you say that there is what would be purely with lots of, not purely is a bad word, but typically Greek topics and concerns within science fiction or fantasy that you might have observed developing. Would you be able to describe something of it to us? Is it something that is precise enough for you to maybe have a description of?
I think we have too many opinions on that, but I think the Greek preoccupation in science fiction is kind of how much worse are things going to get, and is there any possibility that I might be able to do something to stop it? But we are very pessimistic.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's because, for the reasons we described previously, there was a lot of pressure for literature to be serious. A science fiction author might have felt double the pressure to deal with serious matters because the genre wasn't taken seriously. So they wanted to showcase what it actually can do in terms of culture and society and politics, because that was what made you literature, supposedly. And so science fiction, it tends to be two things. Satirical, in a way. I mean, one of the first science fiction authors that was accepted by the mainstream because he was already a very well-known journalist was Freddy Germanos. And his science fiction work was mostly satire. And currently, I think we actually have an anthology coming out with an unknown Kadath editions. And our main topic was, is this too dystopian?
Is it too black?
Yeah. And we're
dark.
Yeah, we're finishing with a story by Kalliopi Papadopoulou, which is the publisher asks, he says, isn't it too dark? And I'm like, why is it dark? It's the most
uplifting.
It's the most uplifting. And he's like, the whole of humanity has died in that story, and there's only one person left.
Yeah, but she lives and she's actually happy.
But I mean, actually, it didn't even cross my mind, because that's what science fiction does in Greece. It tells you things are going to get worse. How can we stop that? How can we make things better? How can we resist? In a lot of ways, it is a literature of resistance.
Yes, also, that's what I've noticed again and again and again so many stories of resistance and revolution, so many stories either in fantasy or in science fiction, or even not in horror that much, but you can find a revolution everywhere in Greek speculative fiction. But it tends to not end well. Let's say that.
It doesn't end well or badly. Mostly, it's a lot of the stories end when the protagonists decide to fight back, despite somebody making very clear events, making very clear that this is not going to be easy. But resist, from the political situation, like in most of Europe, I think it was turbulent. There was a lot of change, a lot of conflict.
Yes.
That's what that's what Europe does best, I think. Change and conflict, and that's the thing. It is reflected in the way we imagine the future. But I feel obligated to point out that finally, it's pretty obvious that things are starting to change. We still want to write about resistance and change, but there are authors that now dare to suggest that, maybe things will turn out all right. I have a conspiracy theory. Maybe everything will be all right.
I think Dimitra is being a bit optimistic because it's an inside joke that no Greek can actually write solar punk. Well, yes,
It's
because we've tried a lot, and I think I can find one or two people.
We have Kostas Charitos, who's
Yes.
I think his most well-known novel is Project Fractal.
Yes.
He has written more recent ones, but it was actually one of the first truly optimistic in a heartfelt way, stories that I read. Atalante Evripidou recently published Solar Punk in the magazine of Aleph, the Greek club of science fiction, which is
Chronicles of the Fantastic.
Chronicles of the Fantastic, we would call it. Yeah,
Yes,
Fantastica Chronica, if you allow me the
in
Greek
Greek.
title. It's an amazing magazine, and we're lucky to have it and be able to contribute to it. But it was published there, and for an institution that is a bastion of Greek science fiction, which means the trend of pessimism is strong there. To actually come out in this
With an optimistic story.
A solar punk story, it is not something to frown upon. And we have seen it as a trend. People saying, of course I'm going to resist, but you know what? I might have a chance at making it too.
Sorry?
I have a chance of making it too. I mean, I have a chance of succeeding in my resistance as long as I remember we are all in this together, because that's another trend. Success has to be collective.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's also a common theme about collectivity and
nobody can do it alone.
Yes.
And that's interesting because I was about to maybe I ask if there was like a specific flavors. You kind of already have answered that, but there is obviously there is a revolutionary trend in France when we write. Maybe not, fantasy a little, sci-fi definitely, and steampunk obviously, but more in an aesthetic way. But recently, we do have seen this particular evolution that uses that tends towards what the solar punk movement wants to do, which is bring in optimistic angle to this. But that's I didn't think I had this image of pessimistic Greek sci-fi, as you said. It's really interesting to hear that you have this evolution as well, and going you say that concerns science fiction. Would you say that fantasy has a similar evolution as well?
Fantasy is not pessimistic in us. Fantasy can be anything, more or less. But I think fantasy is a great way for Greek authors at this point. It's a great way for Greek authors to rediscover their folklore and mythology, because here is the problem with our folklore and mythology. First of all, and it's going to sound a bit complaining, but bear with me, our mythology, our antiquity has been, of course, it's well known around the world. It kind of belongs to everyone, and that's great. But people tend to interpret it through their own lens. And the dominant lens is of a very white, a literally whitewashed antiquity. I think by now we know that these things weren't even white when they stood there, right? At first. And we can't really, we don't know why, you can't really relate with the image of antiquity that is presented to you coming from the outside. You know, when you had these stories excavated by foreign archaeologists, because you were fighting a war actually, so somebody had to do it, you get also their image of you. And their image of you was one of extreme rationality, was one of philosophy, moderation, and that was, you know, kind of a Greek wonderland. It wasn't like that. Not to mention that this was Attica, not the entirety of Greece. Greece is a country that is extremely whose cities and islands and everything is extremely separated by geography. Mountains, rivers, what have you. So there is a multiplicity of antiquities. So Greek fantasy authors that actually succeed and resonate with the public are the ones that are inspired by the actual antiquity, the actual folklore. For example, the most well-received, the best-selling of fantasy in Greece was Aegitis Taktis, Sons of Ashes by Lefteris Keramidas, which was inspired by, I wouldn't say Byzantium, by, it was an alternative, a secondary world, but one in which the equivalent of Constantinople never fell. And so there was a continuity. And that was the one trilogy that really stood out. We also have Euphemia Despotaki, who is inspired by the Hellenistic world, and whom we call our high priestess, more or less, because everybody knows her, everybody who deals with speculative fiction in Greece knows her, and her stories stand out because there is nothing imitative about them. They are actually inspired by an existing folklore, by an existing history, even though their worlds are supposedly secondary. In the same way that Middle Earth is secondary, of course, it's instantly recognizable as well. And currently, of course, there are the fantasy authors who are doing retellings and revisiting antiquity with a very different eye. And, there is, right now, there is a huge, I can see a trend for retellings of Greek mythology. I'm guessing next year it's going to be something else. But right now, there is something like that. And it's also either inspiring or pissing off Greek authors enough to say, yeah, I should be doing that. You can take it both ways, depends on whether you like the retelling. Oh, and this is great for another reason too. Both folklore and antiquity were appropriated for a very long time by the extreme far right and by the dictatorships we had in this country. And so Greek authors had distanced themselves from it. And now that democracy is stable, you feel free to come back to it and say, hey, this cannot be the domain of the extremists. This belongs to every one of us, and I can actually work with it without being labeled as a political extremist anymore.
Yeah, that's okay. That's good to know, because there is still this trend of reusing over and over the Greek mythologies in very Western Anglo-Saxon dramas, but you can see the shift. The shift of respect, I would say, for the source material, and so that's always interesting. Still still, it's always it's cool to know that there is a Greek movement to reintegrate these stories in a progressive way.
Yes.
I know that there's like cultural battle is being fought right now pretty much everywhere in the West, and it's a question that kind of comes back everywhere, and people are getting in like traditionally conservative icons being reappropriated. In France, we have Jeanne d'Arc, and there's a whole movement actually from trans activists uh, to get this icon back and to say there was a time when it was a progressive icon, even for the old-fashioned left, because she was from humble beginnings and etc. So there's a whole movement of that, and so it's also running in Greece. The other question I kind of have it because there was an easy question for me about telling you that you know Greece doesn't need to do fantasy because it already has a mythology, and you have and you have Lucianos, some
Yeah.
stuff, and what's left to do there. And but that's what we were wondering was about more about the folklore in Greece, lesser known folklore, and perhaps more recent, and perhaps more that has more to do with the country as a whole, taking into account its Byzantine past, its Ottoman past, the different and not the maybe a little more cliche mythological themes.
Yes, exactly. I think the authors to watch out currently for that are Chrysostomos Tsaprailis, who took the lesser known folklore of Thessaly instead of
Mm,
Athens, and combined it with a modern narrative mode. Atalante Evripidou, again, the author who wrote Solar Punk, is coming out with an anthology that is inspired. It actually
A collection,
a
yeah.
collection that actually begins at a time we have been avoiding during the Ottoman occupation and comes up to the years before the 7-year dictatorship. And that's the reason I keep turning my head because there are so many of them that are writing
And of
in
course,
this Efthymia Despotakis, as
of
we
course,
mentioned, is writing in this tradition.
folklore, as you mentioned, it is a huge field, and a lot of people are trying to rediscover it and just bring it forth because it's so rich. And I'm very happy that it's actually interesting to people who are not Greek, to a wider audience. Um, there are also people that there are also authors that draw from such themes, who are writing also in English, like Christine Lucas, Evgenia Triantafylou.
Kristin Lucas is an author who writes both science fiction and fantasy,
Yeah,
and she's almost exclusively, of course, like all of us, she's inspired by all kind of Western tropes and such. But it's interesting to see how she draws from antiquity, folklore, what is actually currently happening now, and writing all sort of speculative fiction, and also inspired by other culture, because you can't only focus on what you are currently doing and how to sell yourself. It's good to be able to play with what comes from other cultures as well.
And now I remembered about Kika Hadzopoulou, who had Threads That Bind out, and it was, I think it was a bestseller. It is a
Yeah, it is a
bestseller.
bestseller
And
in the US and
it,
UK.
it draws from ancient Greek and the whole mythology thing in a new way.
Natalia Theodoridou and Eugenia Triantafylou, of course, and Eliana Castrogianni as well.
Also the Christopoulou. Those are authors that mainly write directly in English.
In English, yeah.
We have there are a lot of authors that write directly in Greek, and then translate, or they write both. For example, there is Iphistion Christopoulos, okay, who has drawn a lot from the Greek reality. Also, Anthony Paschos, who has his last book is not exclusively speculative; it's a collection of stories that's very folklore. Okay, and so he uses dialect and everything.
That's a trend, by
That's
the way.
a trend here.
Using dialect.
Yes, using a dialect and
Local
different
dialects.
local dialects, different dialects, and yeah, that's a trend.
Okay, that's really cool.
Indeed.
There is a
So
discussion.
well, I just want to present two things. People, we're every name that is and book that is being dropped, we will try to get people a list on the
Yes.
display. First thing, and second thing, you talked about Anthony. So for information, for our French readers, Anthony Pascos is one of the first writers we at IKEA published.
Yeah.
We published his novel on which you two also worked for the English translation,
Right.
which is entitled "We Will Accept" in English and "Hard Reboots" in French.
In French. Yeah.
And kind of my reference when I said pessimistic side of the
Oh,
of the
he's
Greek
notorious.
joyfully pessimistic about humanity. But yeah, one wonderful writer, and that's what I was. It's interesting you moved to dialect specifics, specifically public test, because we kind of dropped the English written English subject, but we at IKEA do have somehow the feeling that we are they are sensibilities that the mother tongue, the regional languages, mother languages allow that moving to English doesn't, because and I also saw it with me when I write in English. I instinctively go to types of stories and types of ways to tell stories that I am comfortable with, but I'm comfortable with them because I've been fed mainstream Anglo-Saxon culture, even within sci-fi. And so is it a concern for you that to bring forth a sensitivity in sci-fi and fantasy that is being conveyed through the very Greek language and eventually dialects?
It's a huge concern because we work with students. Some of our students, some authors come to us, and they are starting out, and the majority of them, whether they write in Greek or in English, and they might be doing both, you can see that their mode of expression, not all of them, but most, starts invariably out as English, even if they write in Greek, because that's the mainstream stories, that's the stories we consume. For an author, it is a victory to be able to reclaim their language, the way they actually feel, because you feel and experience things in Greek. It's perfectly fine to be influenced by anything and everything. It's perfectly fine to be translated or to translate yourself, your work yourself, in a reach of a bigger audience. But we would like them to know always that you are free to be Greek when you write. It's okay. It's allowed. And it's understandable why this is not immediately understood. It's not like that's how we felt when we started writing.
Yeah.
And with the ambition of eventually getting published abroad, there's a kind of double pressure. The past that said, don't do it. The future that says, yes, come on, do it. You can get a lot out of it. And then you have to walk the tightrope and express yourself as a Greek and feel it's okay to do so. And not only in a cosmetic way, not only by being allowed to use elements from your folklore, or use a couple of Greek words there because your story is supposedly set in Greece. There is the question of different narrative modes, for example.
Yes. Also, when it comes to themes, there are major differences when a story is written in English or in Greek. I mean, for example, let's take the whole racism thing. Okay, for example, racism in Greece is quite different from racism in the US. Okay, so there are cultural elements that we feel relate to us, but they actually don't, because we don't live there. We have only a second-hand experience. So it's very interesting when you try to when an author tries to deal with these themes without realizing that it's a second-hand experience. The story sometimes falls apart because it stops making sense. Um, so yes, it's the same thing when we see that I don't know, a sci-fi that is set in Greece, and there is a huge organization, for example, like NASA, but it's Greek. That's it.
That's the best case scenario, because it assumes that things
we're
went swimmingly.
superpower. I don't know.
Oh no, it just assumes that you were able to build it, or that you build it, as a European effort. The weirdest thing is when an author feels that they cannot write about a Greek astronaut, even if they place their story far into the future.
Yeah.
And if we would like people to know that you can write about anything. That's why it's called speculative.
Of course.
But you don't have to imitate anyone or try to convince anyone. Writing is about expressing who you are, and you can't sideline your language or your national identity. It's one thing to want to be understood by as many people as possible, and it's a different thing to feel that you have to hide.
Or to conform, or to assume that everything going on in the international level is also your problem or burden. Yeah,
that's done a lot when people try to use language that is mainly used on social media as a way to show that my piece has the right politics. And it's like, yes, but that's not a problem that your characters would actually encounter, because they don't live online. They live in your story. So why are they speaking as if they're tweeting? Because you really want to do the good thing and be a part of this discussion. And it's true that speculative fiction in Greece did a lot for progressive causes, because the authors were young, because they were less scrutinized, and because they were taking a lot of cues from the international discourse. And so they were among the first to adopt. I think
to include queer characters, to include.
He's being modest, but I think that in his novel he had the first queer protagonist in speculative.
Not queer, but I'm not sure about non-binary. But yeah, it was one of the first anyway. And I didn't realize it back then.
Now they're everywhere, I must tell you.
Yes, but I didn't realize it back then that what I was doing. And well, it was very optimistic that it got picked up immediately. By a small publishing house, but it did. So that's a good thing, I think. And now
it's still in print. I mean, I think that, what, the market is always more ready and accepting than the publishers realize, at least in Greece.
Yes.
That's, I think, one of our major problems here was that publishers were assuming an audience that was the audience of 2 decades prior, while actually the audience really wants a good book. If the book is good, the politics, how progressive it is, if it is speculative, will matter a bit less. But this is not always, I can, since we've worked a lot in publishing houses, we can understand the worry for keeping the lights on that makes them less likely to take risks. And that's why self-publishing helped in some ways.
Okay, and I have follow-up question, but since you move both in the academic field and in the publishing field, do you feel like the evolution today with speculative fiction, but let's say science fiction and fantasy to take the more cinematographic ones, do you feel like it's more and more uh, well considered within the I don't know, the kind literally elite of the country? Because if I take the case in France, we have a long, we've been fantasy, and to a lesser degree sci-fi has been the bad student of the class for a very very long time, and now we are kind of moved to being the cute student of the class, not still but likable. So I wonder if you have a similar evolution on your side.
That's interesting. When it comes to academia, with the exception of Dr. Domna Pasturmadji's work, there was no academic research in that.
Mm.
There was some research on the themes of folk, but here is the thing. When I started doing my PhD thesis about, I think, 10 years ago, everybody was, what? You are allowed to do a PhD on that? And now there are a bunch of people calling me to say, okay, can you help? Because I'm doing something similar, which is
Mm.
great. I mean, it's great to see that it's not the odd one out anymore, because people really want to deal with it, and they have the bibliography, and they actually, there is still not enough research on the Greek side of things, I'm afraid.
Mm.
I'm hoping to change that eventually by adding to that, but academically there is not a lot of it. When it comes to cultural gatekeeping, there is an interesting phenomenon. We also have authors who do not belong to the scene, to the speculative scene, but are the authors that are very welcome in literary circles. They are likely to pick up awards. Let me, for example, we have Ioanna Bourazopoulou, who I think has been published in French, Michalis Makropoulos, Ursula Foskolou, and Yannis Adamis is another. I'm sorry for constantly turning my head, but there are so many of them. And these authors are Fisas, yes. These authors are handling speculative in a very different way than the speculative scene. They will not usually be found, in Aleph or in the Tolkien Society. They will not be at the cons or in the literary workshops where the majority participates. Theirs seem to be a more solitary endeavor. And there is also a tendency not to obey the tropes of the genre, but to use the fantastic, I wouldn't say speculative, to use the fantastic as a kind of a surrealism exercise.
To make their point.
In order to make, a point about things. It makes for a very different kind of read, a very literary read, in which the fantastic functions more as a tool or as play.
Yeah, as an allegory, kind of.
Yes, as an allegory, as an excuse sometimes to leave a lot of things up to interpretation. A way to kill the author and to ask the reader, what do you think? This is the kind of writing that is very appreciated in literary circles. But now, of course, things are not exactly segregated. For example, some of these authors have appeared at Aleph's institution. Aleph happens to be the one institution that is collaborating a lot with the mainstream institutions, museums, etc. So they're easier to approach, and they do great work, I must say. But you'll see them there. They have been invited in cons. Ioanna Bourazopoulou, for example, has talked at cons. Zirana Zatel is another author that definitely is both a speculative and mainstream. But I'd say mainstream, not mainstream and literary and speculative, which is the dream,
Yeah, but they used to be this whole literary scene used to be more segregating than the rest of the. I don't want to say pure, but
the
genre-oriented scene. But now, lately, we've seen this bridge crossed more and more. Okay, and that's I think that's very hopeful. That's why we keep mentioning that there are authors who mainly write speculative fiction, who are crossing over to major publishing houses, to quite literary publishing houses, and that's I think that this is a win for the scene in general. So yeah.
And I must say something else about the scene. That's one of the few benefits of having a relatively small, a relatively small scene due to the size of the country, is that most of the authors and the graphic designers, the other creators, because it's not only, you can see a lot of people are really tight knit and help each other with suggestions, recommendations, invitations. It's a very lively scene in terms of, okay, we want to do this, we are open. It's not that
it's not a cutthroat.
It's not a cutthroat. It's quite the opposite. When we want something done, people are very happy to present others with the opportunity, to participate. I imagine there has been a sense of us against the world for so long, and we probably still have that. As in, yeah, okay, if we don't look out for each other, who will do that?
And would you say that it's an ambient that is specific to the speculative fiction writing side of people, or in the wider literary scene in Greece?
We can't speak about the wider literary scene because it's really, really big. Because we have unbelievably many publishing houses, and if there are two things, we have too many of its theaters and publishing houses.
I'm asking that because in France, when a writer who used to do non-speculative fiction comes over and does sci-fi and fantasy and finds themselves in a sci-fi or fantasy convention with other authors, and they're like, why is everybody so nice? We are talking to each other and we are selling each other's book to other people.
That happens a lot here too. I'm glad to hear it happens over there too. Yes, it happens a lot here.
Same experience. I must say that my experience in academia is the same. The ambience and the openness that you have when a conference is focused specifically on speculative, it's a very different. It doesn't mean that. It's different. There is a much more close-knit.
There's a feeling of camaraderie.
Camaraderie, exactly.
Which is really, it can be really intense. I remember the first time that the big con was organized, Fantasticon, was in 2015 in Athens.
With the help of the Society, the Tolkien International Society.
Yes, when that happened, we were all so thrilled. I mean, the atmosphere was so warm, and you realize that everyone knows each other.
You were with 10,000 people, and you felt that everybody was friends with each other. This is not to sugarcoat anything and to say that there are no enmities or there are no people who dislike each other, but the scene is not like that at all.
Okay, well, that's a good sign. That's kind of so. We are 1 hour and 10 minutes within the talk. So basically, anything we do now is bonus. So we do not have. We had questions, but you kind of answered it during the show. People asking if there was a difference between the mythological stories and the folklore. You kind of already.
No, this is a very interesting question. Yes, there are a lot of differences. I'd say that a major but invisible difference is that people feel that antiquity was our moment of pride, and as they write epic stories about it, or the retellings that are current about seeing a story from a feminist perspective, seeing a story from a queer perspective, but the antiquity is the kind of history we view with either a critical eye, because we don't want to. We've seen people using it for ultranationalistic purposes, or we have seen how it is presented at schools, and you always have to go against what you're taught at school. So we have this kind of, while folklore is currently something we rediscover, a lot of it was an oral tradition that had been kept alive without the help of writing during the Ottoman occupation. It is a past from which people in the cities have tried to distance themselves, because it was equated with social recidivism, with unfortunately, the political issues that we said,
Yes.
and we are just rediscovering it and saying that no, we actually have a folklore and an oral tradition, and not just an amalgamation of wonderful traditions.
And it's pretty dark.
It's very dark.
Sometimes themes have to do with taking responsibility.
Getting eaten comes a lot.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Getting eaten comes out a lot. Yeah. Okay. But in general, it deals a lot with the trauma of going through a civil war, which was very bloody and no one talks about. It has to do with how oppressive things used to be in the countryside. It has to do a lot with religion and how difficult things was for different people when it was very prevalent, where religion was very prevalent. It still is now, but of course it's
a secular society now.
Yes.
But when you were in a village in the mountains, yes, religion had a very different role, of course, and it was also, kind of the authority during the long Ottoman occupation.
So yes,
but folklore has a very different atmosphere and aura, and a lot of different things to tell. And people are learning to connect with it now, again, I think. And what we see a lot of is antiquity kind of belongs to all of us, as we said, but with folklore, its author can go back to their own roots, because, again, different folklore for different places, and find something that nobody else knows of. That's the thing. Oh, a question appeared.
Yes, yes, indeed.
What do you think?
Oh, it's a speculative question.
Yes.
So I'm going to read it. So Kallio asks, how do you both see the future of sci-fi in Greece, and what do you think the emerging themes will be in the next 5 to 10 years?
Climate fiction and how we're all going to die.
Yes, I would say the same. I think it's going to be pretty global unless there is another war around our area. So that's going to be different.
Here is what we see, being, actually being serious about it. The good thing with Greek authors is that, despite being, as we said many times, a relatively small sample, they have never, there are overall trends, but authors are very unique in what they express and how they express it. They do not, you cannot mistake one author from another. They do things very differently. And so it's very hard to say, the emerging themes I think they will remain the same. How do you survive? How do you manage to survive in a tougher situation? And the tough situation seems to be two things currently. One is an over-reliance on technology. There is this constant fear of, losing a lot of yourself to the digital, be it AI or social media. And of course, climate fiction, it's very easy to see where we get that worry. So much of the country is coastal and islands, and the fires have brought the realities of climate change very, very close to all of us. So if people write truly from experience and do not attempt to imitate how people in other countries experience that, I think there's going to be a lot of it.
Also, politics. I think that a lot of Greek authors are concerned with what's politics going to be like in 5 or 10 years. So
historically, what we call the years of stone are very close. They kind of ended in 1970. Democracy returned in 1974. So yes, we are very on edge about possible loss of liberty, possible loss of personal freedoms, and it comes up a lot, this fear. Yes. The answer is always resist, resist, resist. That's always the answer, no matter what the question is.
I don't think everyone is going to write solar punk. It's still going to be a minority.
Nobody is going to humor me and finally write actual solar punk for me. I know that.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to write about solar punk while being connected to the emotional state of the present and the near future, right? I mean, okay. I'm the effort is I really respect the efforts put into doing solar punk today, because it really requires speculation to bring it to a good story correlated with relatable emotions. Because I've read, there are solar punk that are so optimistic that you don't connect anymore to the people living the story. You're like, I don't even get when they're happy and when they're sad, because it's made into such a different situation. So yeah, kind of agree that we'll be writing about
kind of sad that we can't
revolution.
I think that a lot of people, when they try to write solar punk, they get stressed that it has to actually provide the best possible solution and show how it's happening, and that stops being a story or an interesting story, and it starts being kind of a manifesto, a prescriptive story, a kind of preaching. A story cannot be preaching. It cannot be. You know what would be a nice solar punk story? If you wrote any type of story and made sure that nobody filled up the tank with gas and they just mentioned solar panels, and that people weren't afraid of going out at night because the area is considered safe. And it's simple. It's simple to imagine a better future, but we feel a lot of the times I should be the one who explains exactly how things came to be, because I don't know. At least in Greece, authors have a lot of. They are told a lot, especially in the early years, that culture has a mission, culture has a duty. Culture is supposed to help people see better futures. It's supposed to help them resist it. And that's too much of a weight to place on the shoulders of someone who is also trying to tell a story. So when it comes to solar punk, which is, if you ask for the definition, they're going to tell you imagining a better future. I think all these school lessons come crashing down on their head, and they really try to write the next manifesto and save the world. That's not a story anymore, of course. I think that's the difficulty. It's not so much that it's difficult to imagine the world getting better, because it has been getting better for a long time now.
So yeah, pessimistic answer. But yeah, well, that's understandable. Also, because I can imagine a lot of today's Greek sci-fi writers having grown up within the last 10 years being like very radically politicized and in their young years, perhaps. So you have this urge to try to convey what you think to the wider range of your readers, right? Perhaps I'm overthinking this, but
I honestly think this was the 90s.
I think we were always overtly political, even when writing personal stories. The personal is political. That's a very common. That's a very common trend in science fiction stories, actually. if there's something we don't do very well, it's cozy.
Yes, that's for sure. We're still waiting for cozy stories. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's very likely. I mean, we are not very. Maybe solar punk is better suited to people who are actually excited to see the sun.
It can also be has a function. It can also have a function of experimental, fiction, which is,
Mhm.
but yeah, we are not going towards solar punk, yeah, solar punk favorite society right now. Uh, but again, very, very, very interesting. People, if you have any other questions, please now is the time to ask it, because we're gonna I think we're gonna start to close this conversation. Last, I absolutely need to ask, now is the time, if you want to, so to recommend any specific author or book, please, you can do it now, of course. Given that we will try to establish a list of all the people you've referenced to later, but if there's someone or one person or one writer or one book you wish to highlight, or present your last work, your own last work, of course, please do so. Uh,
It's impossible to pick one out of the list because we're in a very happy position to have a very wide overview, and we can recommend different people for different things.
But we'll be happy to send
But
the
we're
list.
happy to send the list to be displayed along with the video, because along with that, we realize that our names are not the easiest to keep in memory.
Yes,
So it's better to have things in writing.
they will learn. It is time that we start to. I mean, no, don't worry about it. Yeah, we'll write it down and get people to know it. So you are academics. You have a conference just at the end of the week, as you told us.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, it's from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki,
mhm.
and it's going to be, there's going to be translation. I think also in Spanish. Definitely, there are going to be speeches in English as well. So yes, a conference on the fantastic will be on, and it will be online, and it will be open for anybody who wants to hear more, and maybe listen to some of the authors that were mentioned here, presenting their own. There is an open roundtable in the evenings, so if any, I would be happy to send you the link for anyone who wants to hear even more from more people.
Yeah, please send us. We will share it with our followers, of course. And
Oh,
that, yeah, that promises to be very interesting. So yeah, we'll be there and try to and get to it. Especially, and if it's translated,
yeah, of course.
it's even better. So
yeah.
uh, and okay, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was really cool, really interesting, and we covered. I hope we covered the topic in a way you think was complete, or
Yes.
at least we have a nice a coherent overview of the Greek sci-fi and fantasy uh, publishing world. And so for us, that was our live talk in the conference cycle. We will now be we will now not disappear, because Les Intergalactic Festival is beginning its own streaming marathon in October, and we will have a moment with them on next Sunday for Renai's Positive. We'll talk about Hikaya then. But we'll share every details when it comes by. So for our French followers, don't hesitate to follow Les Intergalactic Festival from Lyon, they will have a bunch of broadcasts that will be very interesting. And as for us, well, we will go back to work on the next book we will be publishing, and you can still find us on all social medias and on our website. You can also find Dimitra and Victor online with the Tales of the Weird writing workshop. So, because you are teachers in creative writing.
Yes, and thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's been very fun, and it's been an
And
honor.
I'm happy you had fun. So we're gonna go. We're gonna disconnect now. Bye, everyone. Thank you for being there. Thank you for the interesting questions, and see you later online or in the books. Bye.
Bye.